Comparative democratization. It's a relatively newer field than comparative studies, and partially I will be talking about methodologically the problems that arise from comparing countries across the world, not just Muslim countries, and then start focusing on Muslim countries. So in democratic transitions, there are two majorly popular schools in thinking how do you mobilize the masses to carry through a democratic transition. One is mainly focused on elite, so the changes from above. And the second one is focused on the masses, so the changes from below. And all of that is under the rubric of rational choice theory that has explained democratic transition through those lenses. But if we apply, for example, the case of the Arab Spring, and we look at the 25th of January rising in Egypt, we will find that the revolution succeeded in overthrowing an authoritarian ruler because of a combination of mass protests and divisions within the elite groups, that is to say, the ruling family and the military. Before delving into more analysis on the Egyptian attempt at democratic transition, a clarification of the state of comparative democratization is essential. So there's a quote from a comparativist who talks about democracy, and he says, democracy is one of the best examples of an essentially contested concept. And we have to hold this in the back of our mind when we talk about democratic transitions. So when we look at the popular trend to quantify in the US and majorly in Western countries, and how it is difficult to measure democracy, even in the most democratic states. We have ample data sets. We have the Freedom House. We have Polity4. We have a less known data set called V-Democracy. But if you look at all the data sets, they're struggling with how to measure democratic change. And there is also the struggle or the thinking between thick and thin theory, which really pertains to what I'm talking about between quantification versus qualitative studies. So when you look at qualitative studies, they tend to be thick. They're full of information. They're full of context, history, knowledge of a culture, and therefore they are called thick theories. A thin theory is typically when somebody wants to generalize, and so they have 100 cases, 100 countries that they're studying, and they say, for example, which was really a theory and still is a theory, that democratic countries do not fight each other. They're peaceful towards each other. Okay, this is a general theory. With the general theory, you lose this ability to capture the nuances of culture and the importance of specific cultures. As, for example, in Muslim cultures, obviously, there is a plurality of that, even in one country. So when qualitative and quantitative analysts say democracy, they literally mean different things. Strictly speaking, research on the causes of thin democracy speak only to the research on thin democratization. Research on the causes of thick democracy has relevance for a longer and richer theoretical tradition. When we talk about, for example, the Arab Barometer data, which is a data set that they used for the Arab Spring, the paper written by Jabal and a couple of other editors about who participated in the Arab Spring compares Egypt and Tunisia. And they explain how they measure piety in Tunisia and Egypt. quote, "To capture levels of piety, we constructed a 15-point scale measuring the frequency with which individuals perform 5 behaviors associated with religiosity, including reading the Quran or Bible and praying. The questioning of the people's practice of the faith is so culturally and politically loaded that responses to those questions risk evaluatory inaccuracies." So this is an example of thin theory, of a theory of somebody trying to generalize in their comparative study what democratization means, or who were the participants in the Arab Spring. Okay. So when we talk about comparative democratization, the divergence in methodology has come at a cost of a cumulative research agenda. So as people who focus on this area, who spend quite a bit of their life focusing on that, we're struggling because there is no cumulative agenda to the research. So it's important to know that when we talk about democratization today, that there is nothing out there in the US or the West in general that has a single agenda or a single definition of what democratization is, because of the methodological differences that I discussed. This divergence, for example, has led to miscalculating certain phenomena such as electoralism and what is called semi-authoritarianism. Electoralism basically is when a group of people go to the voting booths and they elect their representatives, but that's not the end of democracy. This is just the very beginning, because there is no guarantee that the political persons that they've chosen will follow through with their promises. So this is only one component of democratic transition. Unfortunately, a lot of people think, yes, we've got those people to vote, for example, like in Iraq, Iraq is a democracy. Well, obviously not. Also, the problem of semi-authoritarianism, where countries basically try to emphasize that they're a multi-party system, that they have media freedom, all of that, those are just not indicative of real politics. Once you cross a certain red line against the establishment, obviously you see the repercussions of semi-authoritarianism. It is just a power play or a show-off, basically, to majorly Western establishments that country A is trying to democratize. So those are all problems, theoretical problems, in studying democratic transition. Also, the focus on Western context in democratic transition has led to poor theoretical coverage, including African countries, Asian countries, Middle Eastern countries. They are totally off the gamut, off the spectrum of what happens during a democratic transition. The main focus is on the US and the Western world. To give you an example about the last point, there is something called informal networks that the West doesn't pick up on. For example, in the Egyptian revolution in January 25th, 2011, we tend to focus as social researchers on formal institutions. Is there a civil society? Well, in the case of the Egyptian revolution, there were young people. I don't know whether you're familiar with April 4th, the movement. And April 4th, and I've heard that from them personally, they went around in public transportation, whether taxis or metros or buses, and they pretended to talk on the phone, and they gave exactly the time that they're going to meet and that the revolution is going to happen on such and such a place at such and such a time. This is an informal way of initiating or igniting social change and democratic transition. So one needs to strike a balance between exceptionalism and cultural specificity also. We cannot always talk about Islam as being culturally exceptional. We need to understand that we exist in the context of the world, and that there is nothing unique about Islam and democracy. With the many forms of Islam and the many forms of democracy, it is not that unusual or strange to Muslims, I think, to live in a democracy. Secondly, theoretically, most modeling in comparative politics, like I said, comes from a global north, and where the southern part of the world is totally neglected. When we focus on the case of Egypt, we'll find that basically the fight against police brutality sparked the revolution on the 25th of January, and the case of semi-authoritarianism is really manifested under Mubarak's rule. There's an article by Marina Ottaway talking about semi-authoritarianism about that. However, at the end of the day, the military returned in full force. They have control over power. They have control over the economy. I have a quote here: "In everything from housewares and military gear production to farming and tourism, the revenue from these enterprises goes straight to the military's coffers and is disbursed without a state oversight." They are privileged with high salaries, plus preferential treatment in medical care, housing, and transport. And of course, the armed forces also reap $1.3 billion every year in military aid from the United States. So it is basically an industrial empire. The Egyptian military and the relations with the State of Israel also affect how Egypt tried to transition to democracy. Zulda, I quote him, "The Arab Spring and especially the election of Mohammed Morsi was greeted in Israel with great anxiety, more as a threat than as an opportunity." Also, the U.S.-Egyptian military relations, U.S.-Egyptian politics have become intertwined. In March 2014, General Lloyd Austin III, commander of U.S. Central Command, called Egypt an anchor state. In other words, Egypt is too important to let go, no matter what happens inside it. The best proof of this statement is in the numbers. In 2012, more than 2,000 U.S. military aircraft flew in Egyptian airspace. Up to 45 U.S. Fifth Fleet naval ships passed through the Suez Canal annually. When the revolution took place, the United States was hesitant to withdraw support from Mubarak, and although the crackdown on the revolutionaries was brutal, bloody, and internationally televised, it took the US and Europe a while before they timidly supported the revolutionaries. That is to say, it was out of the international embarrassment and not due to real politic calculations that the US succumbed to the interests of the whole nation. The US, however, did not support the revolution wholeheartedly because as soon as Morsi came into power by popular vote for the first time in Egyptian history, a coalition of the military and the old regime kidnapped Morsi, and the rest is known. Basically, there are a few things that are positive in all of this. First, when we talk about Latin America, the U.S. Department of Defense Center for Civil Military Relations has played a vital role in raising political consciousness and providing necessary information for effective civilian control of the armed forces. This has not been provided in the case of the Middle East. Retraining the police, retraining the army is an essential component of democratic transitions. If all those forces are not hand in hand with the civilians who are trying to carry out the democratic transition, it will not happen. On the bright side, demographically, the youth are also they're increasing in number, so the people who ignited the revolution are more than likely to come back. The current situation is, as we see religion and public discourse, there's an increase in restrictions in terms of praying, the Friday prayers in local mosques. People are asked to go to central mosques to be observed, and for the imams to be certain imams from Al-Azhar. Secondly, there's an intimidation of segments of the population who look Islamic. They're not allowed in certain coffee shops. They're not allowed in certain public spaces. Also, a call on Al-Azhar to revolutionize Islam has been part of public discourse in Sisi's speeches. Yes. Last slide. In conclusion, the paradigmatic issues in comparative democratization, whether we talk about grand theory versus historical and cultural context, secondly, domestic level of analysis versus international level of analysis, thirdly, agency in public action and social movements. This is something that is not accounted for. And last thing, the ever-growing gap between secularism and religious segments of the population in Muslim countries, and this is part of the heritage and the legacy of colonialism. And I'll end at this.
Thank you so much. Great points, great considerations starting from the beginning. And as you have raised the lack of civilian support and the lack of the economic power of the civil people. And on the July 15th, Turkish people resisted the tanks, and they did not want the recent Egyptian experience to happen, to realized in Turkey again. That's why people just lay down under the tanks. So it's going to be Abdurrahman Babacan's turn. He is going to speak about AK Party's experience, and he is going to analyze the democratization perspective.
Thank you.
You have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Sheikh, and dear speakers and all participants. Thanks for Istanbul Network for Liberty for this. Today we are gonna make a overview to look at the latest and the old period of democratization period within the AK Party era, namely a descriptive one rather than a philosophical or theoretical one. Just we can make a start between the two stages. We are making three main stages about. I will make two means of classification. One is about the historical and periodic one, that you have seen, and the other one is about the thematic one, the civil-military relations, just as Ms. explained in the case of Egypt, and the other one is about the general human rights issue and the new political vision. And then we will shift back towards this presentation again. We are mentioning about the three main stages about within the AK Party era of regarding the democratization issue. One is about the period between 2002 and 2007, the EU accession process and democratization reforms in parallel with this process. The second period is about, we can talk between 2007 and 2013. I named as the evolution of Copenhagen criteria to Ankara criteria, as Mr. Erdogan himself put it. Namely, the initiated process, the reform process to be institutionalized in line with internal dynamics of the country, particular to the Turkish case, like as Kurdish issue, like as minority rights, like as problematic of freedom regarding the public sphere concerns. And the latest time period from the 2013 to today's that we are living in Turkey, new developments internally and external developments, and the ripple path for democratization process in Turkey. One of the start of our thematic classification is about the civil-military relations. Turkey, since the 19th century, a country that feels the effects of the military in all spheres, as the military as the earliest modernized institution in the country. By that, the army has taken the leadership of direction over society and politics throughout the years, as Ms. explained in the case of Egypt. There needs to be a rapid, radical transformation in the structure of civil-military relations. And according to the Turkish Parliamentary Research Commission report in 2012, the most important motives of the militarization activity could be seen as the presence of silence or visible consent by the civilian, or any no opposition from the civilian society in the past experiences. So one-party state as a totalitarian penetrative model in which military was a supportive and surely the guardian actor of the state and all society. While the transition to multi-party regime, interaction of the army with politics has been mainly shaped according to military interventions every 10 years. So the national security conception is one of the most critical conception within the constitutions, the two main constitutions in the Turkish political history. In order to make a new democratic frame to gain the reform process, minimizing the influence of the National Security Council on Turkish political life, terminating some functions with the executive authorities, and demilitarizing the structure of the National Security Council, firstly. And one about the economic side of the, as the military surpasses all the economic process within Egypt, the related issue is that auditing of the military budget by the Court of Accounts thereafter, and removal of jurisdiction of military courts on the crimes committed by the civilians during peacetime, and other democratic perspective relating the civil-military relations, and reducing the effectiveness of military on education and media also, and the abolition of the protocol on security, public order and assistance units, called as a special name as Emasya, gives the military the authority to intervene in social events when it seems deemed necessary, and the lift of the Emasya protocol was an also important factor. One other, the Supreme Military Council's functions and impacts on the Turkish society and Turkish political life also would be reduced and alleviated. Opening of the trial process of the ones who carried out the 1980 coup was one of the most critical and symbolized development in the process. Abolition of courses on national security information, which means a direct relation between the army and the educational process. And one other important reform was the regulation amending Article 35 of the Turkish Armed Force Internal Service Law, which namely removal of one of the most important parameters preparing the ground for coup, and restricting the scope of the duty of the army anymore. So the other classification about our thematic issue is the new political vision and the human rights issue. The main frame was to be built accordingly in legislative measures to ensure compliance with international human rights legislation, ensuring civilian control of the military bureaucracy, building a political structure based on fundamental rights and freedoms in order to strengthen the rule of law and normalize all the segments and components of the social life, creation of solution for the problem of multiple issues on human rights, such as the extension of political, economic, cultural rights of all societal segments, including various ethnicities and religious minorities also. And the second one, the freedom of thought, expression and assembly in context of international norms. And the last point is about the activation, appearance and effectiveness of the civil society to the relation with the politics. So the main reforms that were to be discussed on is by the first implementation of the AK Party era is ending the 20-year-long state of emergency in eastern region in Turkey, and the reform constituting of the reform monitoring group was another point. So The third point was the establishing the Gendarmerie Human Rights Violations Investigation and Evaluation Center, in which some human rights violations caused by the staff working in military units and then to be subjected to the judgment process anymore. Harmonization of procedures for military courts with the civil courts. Another important point was lifting the death penalty in all circumstances. Another point, and regulation on arrest, detention and questioning in order to protect the rights of the detainees. The new Turkish criminal law, some amendments to the Turkish criminal law to ensure the civilization of the society, and the regulations to broadcast and learn languages and dialects outside of Turkish in new language courses is one. In the past Turkish histories of the red lines, the now abolition of those red lines one by one, step by step, and the ratification of the European Social Charter to implement of regulations to ensure gender equality. Also, the other amendment according to this. And the law on meetings and demonstrations, law on associations, removal of discriminatory provisions against the Roman people, Roman citizens of society, is especially the freedom of assembly and the freedom of cultural rights. And as the last point about the reforms, about the reform process, new cultural and political rights in languages other than Turkish. For instance, TRT channels of broadcasting in Arabic and Kurdish, and for meeting in prisons in Kurdish or in Arabic or etc. And also propaganda opportunities for political parties other than Turkish also. Removal of headscarf ban, which was a terrible issue, was in the near history of Turkish political, especially in 1997 February 28 process, the removal of headscarf ban in all educational institutions and all the public sphere as well. Start of Alevi workshops, which was a spot scene of the segments of society in terms of the division between sectarianism. So the Alevi workshop has to be okay, 5. I'll know. The problems of Alevis come on the agenda and to produce permanent solutions, but the process has been interrupted now for these days in Turkey. We hopefully it will be going on. And as lastly, the democratization package in September 2013, as the facilitation of organization of political parties, the increase of penalty in case of hatreds, the special amendment regarding the issue of hatreds in Turkish criminal law, removal of government commissar on meetings and demonstrations is one of the important points regarding the freedom of assembly, and the creation of opportunity to teach different languages and dialects at private schools, instead of not now the public schools, but private schools was an important development. Establishing a law enforcement surveillance commission on police force to eliminate some individual human rights violations committed by the police to the civilian people. The return of Mor Gabriel Monastery property to Monastery Foundation, who is a religious minority segmentation of the society, which is called as Assyrian. Establishment of the Institute of Romance Language and Culture is the last reform. Yes. What about the fragility point towards future projections? Like as the third stage that leveling a ripple path for the Turkish democracy. The fragility. Where are we, or why are we talking about the fragile today? Started by 2013. Firstly, leak of Oslo peace talks had with the PKK by the National Intelligence Service in order to end the armed forces entirely, and calling for the Under-Secretary of MIT by the prosecution in February 2011. That was a symbol and indicator of a new and difficult phase for Turkey, that Turkey will come in the whole process in last 3 years. Afterwards, consecutively, Taksim Gezi Park's incidents spreading the violence throughout the country in May 2013. Taking power initiative by the Gülen movement, the first initiative for taking power by the Gülen movement illegitimately via its control on judiciary and security mechanism in December 2013. The 6th and 8th October incidents upon call by the HDP, which is a parliamentary party, which is a Kurdish party, Central Executive Committee, with a threatening tone by Demirtaş, Selahattin Demirtaş, who was a co-chair of the HDP, which ended, the whole process ended with 41 people lost their lives brutally in the eastern region and southeastern region of Turkey. The new urban war strategy that the PKK launched by digging ditches in the streets and civilian settlements was one of the most important and breaking points in the last 2 years, ended with a big number of loss of lives, the relocation of civilian populations to other safe havens, destroyed houses, and upset cities, unfortunately. And surely, as you may know, the unsuccessful coup attempt on July 15 by the Gülen movement, which lost as 251 lost and 2,196 injured people just within 15 hours in that night. And lastly, at the intersection time period of 15 July with the ditch war process performed by PKK, just in a 1.5 years, just in a 18-month period, totally in just 18 months, totally 27 terrorist attacks performed by the PKK and the ISIS occurred, which lasted with 511 deaths of people. Firstly, so change of minds, a must, long-term and bidirectional process, the relation between the civil society and government. Secondly, to be seen and talk that we could see, we must see and talk on. One, pointing out methodological and institutional frameworks and arrangements while explaining a social phenomenon instead of perceptions and abstract explanations on any social case. Secondly, the situation that the AK Party is trying to realize in the first two stages is precisely that these institutional arrangements. And thirdly, the point that overlaps when going to the third stage is that traditional reflexes appear again and the confusion about the responses that the AK Party will give to this new situation. Hence, the balance on reformism and security is neither theoretically nor practically being properly operated by the AK Party in the last 2 years. And thirdly, the question, I am now concluding, Mr. Chair, as the last, just you can see. Then, thirdly, some questions and some hesitations about the future projections of democratization, whether fully reflected of all these legal proceedings and institutional arrangements into the practice. A question on that. In addition to structural problems, inability to give up traditional attitudes and habits for military and civil bureaucracies, which will make it difficult for the human rights reform in its spiritual manner. Inadequacy to take strong and decisive initiative for completion of entirely new constitutional process by the government, holding apart all from the political controversies. And confusion on future projections of next policy implications concerning the expansion of basic civil rights, including also even the terrorist attacks performed by the PKK, including also Kurdish issue, the next policy implication of the Kurdish issue and other identity-based issues. And rising impression of ignorance of a significant portion of society stemmed from the language and tone used by the government officials in recently is another negative point. And some reactions in the aftermath period of the coup attempt, I am listing now, performing all the transactions through the regulatory transaction, the delegated legislation that should normally be done by personal transaction, as this is a methodological fault. The second fault is about the labeling the dismissed peoples as of membership and affiliation to terrorist organizations without being devolved to the legal process. and resorting to large volume of legal and administrative measures without considering the highly probable social costs, and lastly, the probable risk of outflow of the process beyond the scope of the delegated legislations, which is called as KHKs, which is in nature legitimate, legally legitimate, in nature legally legitimate by means of directly based on articles of the Constitution, which regulates the conditions of declaring the state of emergency and issuance of delegated legislations. Thanks.
Thank you. We will continue after the discussions, after the questions as well. Now it's turn to Dr. Nehad Khanfar from Middlesex University on the critical assessment of Hamas.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers for this wonderful event and conference. I hope you will enjoy some of my input on Hamas, and I hope I will be very obedient. I'm not going to exceed the time, and hoping to open more floor for questions. Hamas in Arabic means enthusiasm. So we will together investigate whether Hamas was actually enthusiastic on democracy and democratic transformation. But first of all, we have to consider two facts. One of them is related to the historical roots and origins of Hamas, which is the historical link and connection with the Brotherhood or Muslim Brothers, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun, mainly in Egypt and in Jordan. And secondly, considering Hamas being actually in a struggle, long struggle, like the other Palestinian factions with the Israeli occupation. So we're not talking really about a stable state or a stable system or regime. So we have to consider some exceptions sometimes. So not really to forget ourselves talking, for example, about Tunisia or Turkey or Egypt even. So we have to consider these elements when we evaluate Hamas democratic transformation. Starting with this, going through the literature of Hamas, especially the official literature, you wouldn't find any attempt of relating Hamas to democracy whatsoever. Apart from few exceptions, they are really very marginal exceptions. It's very hard to find any term or word would link Hamas to democracy or to the democratic values. Secondly, the language, the statements, the expressions of Hamas literature and its leaders or spokespersons would really be missing this kind of terms. And this is, of course, always justified that Hamas in a continuous struggle with the Israeli occupation, which is, to some extent, is correct. Along all this history, you would always consider this kind of contradicting and confusing messages sent by Hamas or its closing circle of Hamas, or the closer allies of Hamas in the Palestinian politics, talking about sometimes democracy, sometimes talking about democratic values, sometimes talking actually aggressively against the democracy and being totally anti-democratic. But to some extent, many would argue that Hamas has many elements would relate it and build that connection between Hamas as a political or semi-political party, because you have to consider the militant part of Hamas as well, Al-Qassam Brigades, which is known actually to be the most important part within Hamas organization. And this kind of elements, it's claimed to be actually experimented and proved. We'll see whether this is the case or not. Based on that, or the analysis is based on that Hamas is showing somehow some signs of tendency towards the democracy. Now, accepting to some extent, accepting to deal or to be involved in democratic process, it is something would be considered as a sign of accepting the democratic value. Being part of the student unions elections, trade unions, other NGOs, municipal, local elections, and so on. So Hamas is not really that stranger of democracy or being like part of democratic elections. But we have to be very careful when we differentiate between tendency towards adopting the democracy and accepting to be part of democratic operations from time to time. Now, the major move happened in Hamas history, the decision of being part of the parliamentarian election for the Palestinian Legislative Council in 2006. This was really crucial, although we have to remember that 10 years before that date, 1996, when the first Palestinian election were carried out, Hamas issued a fatwa by some of affiliated scholars saying that participating in this kind of elections would be haram. It's prohibited based on Islamic evidences or Sharia evidences. Taking over the power or being like the winner in 2006 with quite comfortable majority, forming the government, testing Hamas behavior, talking about political behavior, being in charge in the government, didn't give really any sign that Hamas was carrying out any relation or trying to build that bridge between itself as an organization, being in charge in the government as well, and the winner of an democratic elections, didn't show that they are willing to implement any of the democratic values. Participating in the election to take over power and not to adhere to the democratic values and demands, because the calls were all the time to Hamas that you have to show the implementation of the democratic value when you are in power, and this would be a reflection of your electoral manifesto. Then many consider this to be really a tactical step from Hamas to be part of the establishment, but not to be part of the comprehensive democratic process. One of the main prominent Hamas leaders, late leader, as a matter of fact, stated, and this is something documented, which surprised me myself, being a very close observer to Hamas progress for the last 20 years maybe, said that democracy to us, it means taking over the power, and then it will be a Sharia commitment from our side to eliminate the other elements, the secular elements, communist elements, whatever not related really to Islam or Muslim and not committed to the Sharia principle, which is something really very dangerous. And Mushir al-Masri, which he is a current elected parliamentarian representing Hamas in the Palestinian Legislative Council, and this is something was repeated in one of his books for almost 15 editions, which is something repeatedly like confirmed time over time. For people who are following Hamas or the political progress of Hamas, you will find out that they used to have two charters. One charter, which is the foundation or the founding charter, was 1988. You would check it as the most focused political literature of Hamas, didn't actually mention anything related to the democracy. But the recent one, which is just a few months ago, 2017, we started to see some elements of democratic values clearly, without any hesitation, mentioned and indicated within the charter. And this might really give us an idea that Hamas, after almost 11 years of the victory in the election, started to realize that something got to change. But we are not sure yet. Now, within Hamas, if you look at their structure, you will find something very hard to spot, that Hamas within its structure is a democratic. It doesn't show anything. The last election, which was held just a few months back, usually just really announcing the results of the election. We don't know what's happening within Hamas as an organization or as a political party. Just will tell you, this is the leader, this is the head of the political office, and these are the members. But what is the process? What kind of process and procedures, candidates, all this kind of scrutinization of the democratic process or in the democratic process are not shown at all. So we wouldn't really judge the democratic or to what extent Hamas is a democratic party or witnessing a democratic transformation by checking or testing their behavior within Hamas internal. But something I have spotted and I have to report with regard to the culture of Hamas, to find the founder or the co-founder of Hamas, late Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, which is the spiritual father of Hamas, he actually stated at the very beginning that Hamas is willing to be part of the democracy, willing to accept any results coming out of democratic process, and would accept really to have a secular party governing them, and they would accept that, which is something would oppose the young generation statement in Hamas. Of course, there is Ahmed Yusuf as well, and Ahmed Yusuf is part of like a prominent political leaders of Hamas, highly educated, and he's promoting this idea that Hamas even not a religious party, which is, I think, something out of context to me. But he was brave enough to say that we are very committed to every single value promoted by the democracy. Now, decision-making in Hamas would be actually scrutinized in the same way, where no one would understand what's happening, who's taking the decisions, what kind of process and the procedures. So this is something would lead us for like more confusion. Findings, which is very short, you can read more findings in my paper. I found that Hamas by itself, like Hamas within, from within, is confused about itself, whether really to adopt democracy or to be very far from the democracy, like doesn't want really sometimes even to be affiliated. Most of its leaders, they would really just escape away when you talk about democracy. On the grassroots as well, they have this kind of confusing messages towards the democracy, but they are still keeping this rigid line that democracy is not an option in Hamas. And this is, of course, led by something called the Da'wah body or the Da'wah department, which is something kind of concerning when we talk really about the democratic transformation. And then Hamas doesn't really know where it comes with regard or where it stands with regard to democracy and the democratic values. And I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
I think everything is clear, and I hope there is no question. If there is any, please line up here quickly. We will just take kind of 15 minutes from our lunch break, shall we? Or we may not. So if there are any questions or comments, please keep it very short, so that the others can join. May I see who are going to contribute so that I will give time very quickly, please?
Yes, I have a mic, so I'm going to ask a question. So Dr. Nehad, I really wanted to get your perspective on how you're measuring, I'm not really pro-Hamas or anything, but how are you measuring an institution or a party under occupation with the same measurements that we are applying to countries? It's really difficult, and you mentioned that in your paper, but it is almost impossible, which is a catch-22. This is exactly the constant blame that is blamed for all Islamic parties. You know, is it a one-man, one-time deal, or is it more than that?
Are there any questions in this line so that we will? Okay, all right, on three.
Standing for questions.
Okay, then we'll finish after these three.
So this is Husnul Amin from Pakistan. Thank you for the insightful presentations. My question is to Dr. Nehad. In the literature, there is some discussion on the Erdogan effect on Middle Eastern politics, starting from Egypt to Tunisia. So is there, that thing is something you see? The Erdogan effect on Hamas?
Thank you.
Okay, I have two questions, one from Dr. Deina. In your presentation seems to show that there's an evident presence of one is a deep state, being the military. Having said that, and having showed the nature of the new nature of social movements, being leaderless and free from cadre type organization, why is the hope for democracy in the Middle East, as we have seen the reverse of the Arab Spring? My second question to Dr. Abdurrahman, regarding the Gulen movement or the Veto movement, there have been some reports saying that Erdogan is chasing them all over the world. And all the bearers of the Gulen school all over the world has been captured and taken back into Turkey. And this, a lot of people say, is a violation of human rights, namely the United Nations Conventions Against Torture.
You mean the schools abroad?
Yes, abroad.
Abroad come back to Turkey?
Yes. Taken
in the ownership of belonging of Turkish state, you mean?
Yes, they are being taken back to Turkey, and it's been said that it's a violation of human rights. Thank you very much.
Rafiullah Azmi from India, Delhi. I have one question to Dr. Nehad. My question is this: there is a lot of talk that Arab world and Muslim world lacks democratizations and democracy, but we have history where this process, if it was taking place, and that was sabotage. And one of the important cases is Hamas. Hamas won the elections in 2006 that was the most freest and fair election, but still it has not been accepted by most of the Western countries, and it has been, impediments has been created in way of functioning, and that is going to be very serious problems for the further transformation of the Hamas as a democratic constitution, because it has to fulfill its own constituents for that. So that you need to show the result for that, but they are not being allowed to function. Because the donors, aids, etc., everything is being withheld, and how we know everything is there. My second question goes to my friend Dr. Abdurrahman from Turkey. My question is to this is that Turkey seems to be talked about a lot. It was moving in the right directions since the AKP came, and it seems to everything was going very well. And it was talked about a kind of model for Muslim Islamic world, that look, here is a Turkey, how it is with Islamist bent of mind, Islamist oriented party has come to the power and something is going to be played. But what has happened? After this Arab Spring, everything has gone upside down. So the whole process of democratization and transformation of Turkey in the directions taking the roots of democracy that has received setback, issues of the Kurdish and which was being relatively resolved, means they were being given autonomy in their cultural, religious affairs, etc. Everything received setback. It has become more security questions. And despite marginalizing the role of civilians, military, through amendment in the constitutions, still there was a coup, and that has a possibility that how. So do you think that there is some kind of, apart from internal dynamics, there are external dynamics to this? United States of America, Israel, perhaps they don't wish to be Turkey moving in their directions, and that is what you have a very serious issue with the U.S. Gulen movement, etc. How do you look at this? I would like to have. So just last questions. Sorry for that.
Very quick.
Within AKP itself, I found there's a now authoritarian tendency emerging on that. See, Erdogan, most of his closest friends and followers, his companions who were with him, Abdullah Gül, Dawlat, foreign ministers, and others who were around since beginning foundation of the party, they have gone almost. So it means it is a party surrounded by most of the so-called kind of psychopath people. Those who will not be raising voices, dissent, etc., they will be around. So that is a kind of, though I wish that Turkey could have been transformed in the very democratic process, we were very much excited to see, and we were talking a lot, but this, I think this is some kind of, as in my country, we have a prime minister who seems to be only inevitable persons, that he is the panacea and messiah of all the problems. Erdogan is also, I think, coming that mold and try to say that, look, I am here till beyond 2025 or something like that.
Okay,
you know, that way it is.
Okay, shall we go with the line?
Well, I never promised that there is hope for democracy, because this was the question. Yes, there is a deep state. The only minute hope is the youth who carried out the revolution. Their demographics are increasing. They're increasing in number, and they're eventually replace the old mentality, the control of authoritarianism on the Egyptian state. Just want to add a minute thing. When we talk about the creation of a constitution in democratic transition, this is a make it or fail deal. This is a very crucial and important part of democratic transition. And when we talk about all the laws that have been passed by AKP to try to open up the society to egalitarianism, if you don't follow up on those laws, if the people do not feel safe enough, the laws are not effective. unless there is this respect between everyone and everybody respects the other without the law even, this is the true democracy. Thank you.
Thanks. For my friend from Malaysia, he asked about the Gülenist movement's educational institutions and schools to be back to Turkish state is against or properly with the international human rights. Of course, surely any educational institution or some other institutions within any country, like as Malaysia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, other ones, should not be subjected to direct intervention by Erdogan himself or the Turkish government or the Turkish judgment process. That's not properly with the international human rights, but international law especially. But as far as I know, there is not any case that Erdogan also or any Turkish official, government official says that all the educational institutions or institutions by Gülenist movements should be backed, must be backed, has to be backed to Turkish state ownership anymore. This process totally related with within the intergovernmental and interstate, inter-country process of the implications and reactions towards the Gülenist movements, all the institutions and all the people belong to Gülenist movements that's directly within the country, within Turkey. So our friend's main question about the foreign, especially what has changed by the last 3 or 4 years. Surely we can, we should make, and we have to make a double way bi-directional way of thinking about explaining any social case. One is that yes, there tends to be a confusion about the balance on freedom and security in the last periods of Turkey, but we should also take into consideration that the root causes of these new confusion process and complicated process of Turkish case, just because, as I detailed and deeply mentioned within the presentation, by the last 3 and 4 years, even any country could make and could overcome such big, huge crises and devastational processes would no longer be for any safe, or would no longer be for totally human-oriented and totally respected for human rights. Also, yes, we are accepting some confusion and some violations and human rights, but the most critical point is that whether these are performed by a systematic reflex or some kind of periodic and in a transitional way. For instance, let me take the example of France. France, after the terrorist attacks performed by the ISIS, a 23 months long state of emergency has been existed in France. Totally serious people, I guess I have some numbers, 25,000 people have been watched and monitored within this state of emergency process in France. Also 4,496 people and addresses has been subjected to conductment of a raid by the police, of French police. 19 sanctuary place of worship were closed down, and 75 zones were to be built up as a security zone in France. So to make a just and fair conclusion, we are making the Turkish government's the critical points about the human rights violations in the latest periods, but let you take example of the listed within the presentation in just 3 years if of any country. Forget about Turkey. Any country, just because that I'm mentioning to be a just and fair position in evaluations, in all evaluations. And within the AK Party, yes, you are right. Within the AK Party, the all closest counterparts of Erdogan has being in passive positions within the party in the recent years. That's truly, and also the insiders, criticals of the AK Party officials also made the same criticism as you made. But according to me, that just seems, that just shows us a tendency, maybe an emotional or a methodological break among the counterparts of the foundation of the AK Party, such as Abdullah Gül, such as Bülent Arınç, such as Ahmet Davutoğlu, such as Ali Babacan. But nevertheless, it has not become an end for those all the peoples for making politics within AK Party, and also they are now member of parliament within AK Party. But yes, a short and brief as a signal. Yes, you are right. That's a signal, and to be overcome by Erdogan and to be criticized by Erdogan himself. Okay, thanks.
Continue during lunch.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just quickly answering, of course, the measures, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, it shouldn't be considered as really normal, but the measures would be within the Palestinian political family. This is my answer, not really compared to Tunisia or Egypt or any Erdoganism and its influence on Hamas. I think there was a serious debate, and still they have the debate between following Erdogan and Ghannouchi example, or just to stick to the Egyptian one. And still they don't know where to go. And you can see they are sometimes here, sometimes here, sometimes, so you can't really decide or spot a clear line where they are going or heading. For Hamas and its commitments towards the democracy, as a matter of fact, if they accepted to be part of a democratic process, then automatically logic would say that they have to show some tendency, even with this exceptional situation where all the Palestinians are suffering from. But if you say I am part of the democratic process, then you have to show some signs. But I think Hamas is not an exception, compared to the other Islamist parties. So they are falling in the same trap. Not clear, and sending this kind of confusing messages is affecting them actually negatively, rather serving their purposes in being staged on a democratic stage or stand. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to add a few points, my opinions as well, if you would listen. I think this Turkey being as a model was very much exaggerated. Since we are discussing since the beginning of this conference, every country has her own experience, history, model, futures, cultures. So claiming a country to be a model was not appropriate, and now blaming with everything and with one person is not appropriate as well. With the Arab Spring and the expectation of democracy created an uncertainty, not for the local people, for the international world, particularly by the Western world, and that was not favored. The uncertainty through democracy within Arab Spring was not favored. Thirdly, with Turkey, I would like to raise your attention to the fact that first ever in Turkey's history, and which is very rare in world's history, that we are punishing through judicial process the coup plotters. This is our first ever historical experience, and we are making some mistakes as well. But trying to find our way, we have to find our way within rule of law, how to punish coup plotters. And the last point is that this is also first ever that we are trying to fight against an intelligence crime group like the Gülenists, which is not within only the country, which is expanded all around the country, not as a typical intelligence group, but which acts like a charity group. So this should also go in line within rule of law, within judicial processes, but it has many aspects, dimensions. So thank you so much for your heavy involvement and attention to our two sessions in this morning.